It was the greatest adventure of the 20th century. With a thrust of more than 150 million horsepower, one of the world's most powerful rockets was launched from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida on the 16th of July, 1969. In the Cold War with the Soviet Union, the U.S. wanted to prove that they were the land of boundless possibilities and superior to communism in the struggle of ideologies. Three astronauts embarked on a dangerous journey to the moon. 4 days later, more than 500 million people saw the first humans live on the Earth satellite.
We did something that nobody else has ever done, and it's never been repeated. So it gives us just a sense of satisfaction that we did something pretty special.
The moon landing was also the success of many scientists and engineers from Germany. Around 120 rocket builders around Werner von Braun and more than 30 aviation physicians around Hubertus Struckhold worked on the project for years. The participants became heroes because in the Cold War between the superpowers, they contributed to deciding the race into space for the U.S., a spectacular triumph that long outshined the dark shadows of the Germans' past. Huntsville, Alabama. The landmark of the city in the south of the U.S. is the U.S. Space and Rocket Center. On display here are rockets that have shaped the history of space travel. The art of German engineering is not only to be found in the Saturn V moon rocket, but also in the equipment that ensured the astronauts' survival in space. The Germans and the American space program, a seemingly unique success story.
They were just years ahead of us. Well, I'm not saying that we would not have eventually gone, but I would say it would have taken 10 years more probably, but if we hadn't had the German leadership.
The Saturn rocket was Arthur Rudolph's masterpiece. The Thuringian-born program manager orchestrated the complex joint project of thousands of engineers and the various supplier companies.
He was a great troubleshooter and a great manager in everyone's opinion. And he was a tough taskmaster, as they call it. But he was so focused on the job that he just would let time pass. And people, sometimes working 10 to 12 hours, 15 hours a day. And you hear stories told about it, people trying to sneak off and go to the restroom, and he wouldn't let them.
He has received several awards for his work. Among them, he was awarded the Distinguished Service Medal, NASA's highest honor. But in 1983, the past caught up with him. In Nazi Germany, Rudolph was involved in the development of the so-called Vergeltungswaffe II, or V2 for short. In order to secure the know-how of the rocket builders, the Americans had brought them to the U.S. after the end of the war in a secret operation. Hints that Nazis and war criminals could be among them were ignored at that time. Only decades later did a unit of the U.S. Department of Justice investigate members of the group for crimes against humanity.
My main concern is I haven't seen any sign of a moral compass in operation. No sign that they ever tried to weigh the criminal activities of some of these people as against the need that was perceived for their services.
In order to understand the entanglements of the U.S. military with scientists of the Nazi regime, one has to travel back in time. At the beginning of the 20th century, the first companies in Germany experimented with a new propulsion technology, the rocket. A meeting point for those interested was the Verein für Raumschifffahrt in Berlin. This even went for newbies. Engineer Arthur Rudolph was fascinated by rockets and encountered an aristocrat who supposedly dreamed as a child of one day flying to the moon. His name was Wernher von Braun. In 1932, the Army Weapons Office made the two of them an offer to further develop this technology. Rudolph and von Braun accepted. When Adolf Hitler took power, the rearmament of Germany had top priority. Under the direction of Wernher von Braun, under strictest secrecy, an entire rocket city was built by the Baltic Sea, Peenemünde. Today, only ruins remain of what was then the largest armaments center in Europe. Only the former power station has survived and is now a museum. Starting in 1936, a gigantic research and test site was built in record time for several million Reichsmarks. Wernher von Braun recruited talent throughout the country. Many would be with him until the moon landing, more than 30 years later. Dorette Schlitt, née Kersten, was 20 years old when she became his secretary.
He inspired people. He had such enthusiasm and charisma. Such a brilliant man. So crazy. And on top of that, he was so handsome.
Arthur Rudolph was responsible for the organization of the technical equipment in Peenemünde. The Air Force delivered what he ordered.
Arthur Rudolph was a very kind person, a kind of daddy guy. And Wernher enjoyed working with him. He was very industrious and knew a lot, and worked on the production.
World War II, which began with the invasion of Poland in 1939, put the Peenemünde people under pressure. But the new technology was complicated and difficult to control. For years, there had never been a missile that flew reliably.
When the people came from Berlin, there was one failure after another. He hated it when they came. He said, "Well, that's really not going well today." And they said he was sabotaging it and only wanted to get to the moon.
It is said that many of the engineers were particularly committed to space travel. But the military was not interested in spaceships. The Peenemünde scientists were to develop rocket-propelled weapons that the Nazis could launch at London, Paris, or even New York.
After the war, the legend was created that everybody at Peenemünde was a space enthusiast. In fact, most of them weren't there to go to the moon, build rockets for space travel. They were there to build a weapon for the Third Reich, and they were perfectly happy to do that.
The test bench on which the missiles were fired is now in a restricted area. A launch on October 3, 1942 went down in the history of space travel. Aggregate 4, the later V2, was almost 14 meters long and weighed around 13.5 tons.
I had to stand close to Wernher with my shorthand notebook, and he dictated. Every second I had to write down what the A4 was doing.
The rocket reached a height of about 85 kilometers. For many, the spaceship was born on that day.
And then it succeeded, and there was a huge cheer.
Und ein Jubel, ein Jubel, ein Jubel.
When Hitler was shown a film of the successful flight of the A-4, he demanded the construction of thousands of rockets as quickly as possible. Peenemünde belonged to the highly specialized scientists who revolutionized weapons technology in the service of Hitler. Engineers made tanks harder and harder, submarines faster and faster, and they developed the world's first jet aircraft. What the speeds and heights achieved meant for the pilots was being researched in a new discipline, aviation medicine. Hubertus Strughold was an expert in this field. In 1935, the Westphalian took over the management of the newly founded Aviation Medical Research Institute of the Reich Aviation Ministry in Berlin. One focus of the research was the rescue of pilots from extreme situations.
Very important for aviation medicine and for aviation in general was the lack of oxygen and acceleration. Those were the main topics. Of course, also the reaction of the human body to this challenge, when the critical limit was reached that even death could occur.
In Peenemünde, at the beginning of the 1940s, there was a lack of manpower to start mass production of the V-2. German men were at the forefront. Thus, one decided on a measure that was already widespread in German industry.
The suggestion came down from the armaments ministry, why don't we use forced labor or concentration camp labor? Rudolf went in April 1943 to the Heinkel-Oranienburg plant north of Berlin, and he saw the concentration camp prisoners being used there, and he came back and wrote a memo saying we ought to use concentration camp laborers at Peenemünde. So he advocated that, and we have that memo for that. And he was responsible for how the prisoners are going to be integrated into the factory at Peenemünde.
A concentration camp was established in Peenemünde West. For the Nazis, these concentration camps were breeding and working grounds for political opponents of the regime and antisocial elements. Reports of the arms factory had been arriving at Usedom since 1939, but for a long time they did not believe in the new miracle weapon. It wasn't until August 17, 1943, that Royal Air Force bombers took off for Peenemünde. At Arthur Rudolph's house, a wall collapsed towards the kitchen. The family could save themselves. The attack would kill about 700 people. The majority of the victims were forced laborers who were imprisoned and were unable to escape the bombs.
People in Trassenheide camp suffered a lot. The inmates who worked for us wanted to get out, but it was all fenced in. There were torn bodies hanging from the fences. It was a horrible sight.
Shortly after the air raid, the order came to relocate.
The intention of the enemies to smash the German armament by planned and massive bombing has failed. In good time and with German thoroughness, war-crucial production was shifted underground.
The rocket factory was located to Thuringia, near Nordhausen. The Mittelwerk armaments plant was built in kilometer-long tunnels of Kornstein. Arthur Rudolph took over the technical management. Once again, prisoners were being used from Buchenwald and the specially built Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp.
The conditions were a catastrophe. The prisoners were cold, they were covered with dust from the mining that was going by, there was rampaging epidemics of typhoid, of dysentery. Prisoners began dying in massive numbers, particularly in November, December 43 and the winter of 1944. So the conditions were really catastrophically bad, a hell on earth.
Drawings by the inmates illustrate the brutality of their everyday life in Mittelwerk. Armaments Minister Albert Speer was confronted with the conditions in Mittelwerk during a visit.
Speer described in his diary that the conditions were so bad and so shocking that some of his men had to be sent off on vacation to restore their nerves. Imagine that. Hardened Nazis were so shocked by what they saw that they had to be sent off on vacation.
Nazi propagandists had color photographs taken in Mittelwerk. They were intended to show how well forced labor and high-tech production go together. Reality was very different.
There is one report by French prisoners that Seidenstucker, this deputy to Rudolf, was involved in personally beating inmates. And we have many other stories of Meister and Vorarbeiter and other leaders in the factory personally attacking prisoners. So even if Rudolf was not directly responsible for hitting prisoners, he was supervising people who did that.
Of a total of 60,000 prisoners deployed, more than 20,000 did not survive. The concept of the Nazis was also annihilation through work. The dead were first burnt in a beech forest, then, later, in the camp itself. In order to maintain production, they requested more prisoners. There's Werner von Braun's signature on this document. When interviewed years later, he admitted that the working conditions were extremely terrible at the time. He did not say that he was personally involved in the planning of the prisoners' deployment.
He essentially had made a Faustian bargain with the Third Reich when he began working with the army and Hitler came to power. And that Faustian bargain played out, and when he got to the Mittelwerk, he really saw the price of that bargain with the devil.
For decades, this horror had been covered up by a cloak of silence. Aerospace physician Hubertus Strughold and his colleagues also later denied any responsibility for how central results of their research were obtained. The development of aircraft that could climb to 18,000 meters raised the question of whether it would be possible to survive a jump from this altitude.
If an aeroplane was shot at and was leaking, a negative pressure occurred, and the question of how long the people remained conscious was extremely important, because they still had to be able to react in order to make the parachute jump.
In the Dachau concentration camp, a series of perfidious human experiments took place in this context. The concentration camp doctor Sigmund Rasche asked SS Reichsführer Heinrich Himmler for permission to use prisoners for experiments. In a vacuum chamber, the prisoners were exposed to a simulated height of 12 kilometers. The first one died after half an hour. After about 200 experiments, it was clear to the physicians that it was impossible to fly at this altitude without a pressurized cabin, suit, and oxygen. At least 70 prisoners lost their lives in the experiments. In Dachau, doctors also carried out hypothermia tests. The prisoners were put into ice-cold water for hours. The aim was to investigate the survival chances of pilots in the cold North Sea, for example. At least 80 people died.
Basically, one can say that certain conditions obviously facilitate this behavior. One can cite the war situation, the dehumanization of the object of research, the idea that there are inferior people with whom one might be allowed to do this. But in the end, there remains a certain incomprehensibility, how it can happen, that one no longer perceives the other as a human being.
In October of 1942, Hubertus Strughold took part in a conference in Nuremberg about the rescue of pilots in distress at sea. The physicians at the Hotel Deutscherhof would also talk about the results of the human experiments in Dachau. At this point at the latest, Strughold showed himself to be a confidant.
At that conference, after the presentation of the Dachau results, Strughold commented, it's in the written record, suggesting that the experimenters should consult information available on the actual temperatures in the oceans that Luftwaffe personnel might parachute into. I read that as an encouragement by Struckold to consider redoing the experiments using quote-unquote correct temperatures. But there was no evidence that, in fact, the experiments were redone at those temperatures.
In June of 1944, the Western Allies landed in Normandy. Hitler hoped that the V-2 wonder weapon could still avert the impending downfall of the Third Reich and fired thousands of rockets at Paris, Antwerp, and London. More than 8,000 people were killed by the V-2. But the Allies marched further and further into Hitler's empire, and a race began on a new front. The future victors were interested in German know-how. Special teams would not only secure secret laboratories and documents, but also capture the scientists responsible alive. The Peenemünde people knew their value to the Allies and had saved important documents. A U.S. division finally took the group around Werner von Braun into custody.
He certainly was concerned about having a bargaining chip, you could say, preparing the documents, and that they would have something to transfer to the Allies, not just their expertise, but also a lot of their knowledge.
Depressed prisoners of war looked different. The rocket men were first interned and interrogated in a camp near Garmisch-Partenkirchen. Arthur Rudolph remembered.
My interviewer said, "Here we are again," from which I concluded that he must be Jewish. But I didn't lick his boots and said whoever wins is always right and makes history.
Some of these long-held secret records from this time are now kept in the National Archives in Washington, D.C. For Arthur Rudolph, the Americans' first report on him turned out very badly. The interrogating officer noted 100% Nazi, dangerous type, security threat, suggest internment.
Rudolph appears to be a completely convinced National Socialist from an early stage. You know, he joins the party in 1931. He is a member of SA until he joins the Army as an engineer, and he seems to be a member in good standing all throughout the Third Reich.
Walter Dornberger, the military commander-in-chief of Project V2, is also recommended to be taken into custody as a convinced National Socialist. Herbert Axter, Dornberger's chief of staff, was described as a notorious supporter and beneficiary of the Nazi regime. It is known that Kurt Debus, the person responsible for the rocket launches, was a member of the SS. Later, it turned out that the future leader of Cape Canaveral had also denounced an employee to the Gestapo. Contrary to President Truman's explicit instructions not to bring Nazis and war criminals to America during Operation Paperclip, the military were convinced that scientific utility was more important than war guilt. For this, they also resorted to questionable methods.
I have seen security reports go from was an ardent Nazi to not an ardent Nazi, redoing security files despite the absence of any change of information is what for sure happened.
In another security report about Arthur Rudolph, there was no more talk about the glowing Nazi. Now it said, he was no glowing Nazi, and he is also no security threat to the U.S. In July of 1945, the Allied victors met in Potsdam. Germany was divided into occupation zones. Nordhausen and Mittelwerk were located in the future Soviet occupation zone. The German missile builders set out clear conditions for the Americans. Arthur Rudolph remembered.
The news that Thuringia would fall to the Soviets led us unanimously to decide that we would not go to America if the Americans did not bring our families to safety from the invasion of the Soviets.
Americans weren't just sending trucks to evacuate families to the western sectors. Contrary to the agreements with the Soviets, they also took with them components for about 100 V-2 rockets. Their destination was the White Sands test site in New Mexico. A little later, the first German scientists arrived. There were more than 100, including former members of the NSDAP, like Kurt Debus, Herbert Axter, or Arthur Rudolph. Werner von Braun's membership in the SS was also swept under the carpet. But not everyone in the group was a former Nazi.
Making the whole group as one, whether it be they're all space enthusiasts or they're all war criminals, is wrong. This was a group of individuals. They had widely varying responsibilities, they had widely varying attitudes to the Nazi regime. So there were many people in that group who were indeed just scientists and engineers doing their job. And it was partly simply a matter of luck and partly a matter of their specialization that a few of them became involved with the Mittelwerk.
More than 1,500 Germans received permission to work for the military or the CIA in the U.S. as part of Operation Paperclip. Hubertus Strughold was also on the American wish list. Although the human experiments of Dachau were known, Strughold and his colleagues continued their aeromedical research for the U.S. Air Force in Heidelberg. In 1946, this group was also going to be transferred to the U.S., but suddenly several of the doctors were arrested. Strughold remained at large. Why? Probably because the military protected him. To this day, parts of his file are not publicly accessible. Strughold's colleagues were charged during the Nuremberg trial against the Nazi doctors. But there were no surviving eyewitnesses, and the defendants claimed that it was only the Dachau Dr. Rasche who carried out the human experiments. But he was shot by the SS before the end of the war. The court couldn't prove otherwise. The road to America was clear.
The death of Rasche made it possible for them to blame him, essentially. Basically, he was then some kind of prototype of a myth. And this myth said that a few people with tendencies to be pathological perpetrators were responsible, guilty of medical crime, while the majority of German doctors had adhered to ethical principles, faithful to the oath of Hippocrates, and were only involved a little or not at all.
Under Strughold's leadership, around 30 researchers signed contracts with the Americans and went to the U.S. They worked at the new School of Aviation Medicine at Randolph Air Base in San Antonio, Texas. There, Strughold soon expanded the research program to include questions of space medicine.
Absolute new ground was how a human reacts to weightlessness. They had reached great altitudes during the Second World War, but not beyond. And that was a whole new question. That's where they did pioneering work.
1 year after the end of the war, V-2 missiles were once again being launched at White Sands. The contracts of the Germans were extended. During the Cold War, the Americans did not want to lose the rocket men to the Russians. In 1946, the rocket men's families came to Fort Bliss, a barracks near the test site. Dorette Schlitt was also there. She had married the engineer Rudolf Schlitt and was allowed to go to the U.S.
In Fort Bliss hatten wir eine Wohnung.
We had an apartment at Fort Bliss. Those were old medical barracks. Long barracks. The Americans made 4 apartments out of them. A kitchen, a dining room, living room, and 2 bedrooms. Well, that was fabulous. And that's when I finally met the men's wives, because all I knew of Peenemünde were the men. And that was very interesting and very charming.
Das war sehr interessant und ganz reizend.
In early 1947, the unveiling of Operation Paperclip in the U.S. provoked fierce protests. In a letter to the White House, prominent Americans, including Albert Einstein, vehemently opposed the right of residence of Nazi scientists and their families.
There was a protest wave in 1947-48 over the German program, not over von Braun, but personally at that time, just about the paperclip program. So were a lot of Jewish groups and liberal groups and other nationalities who had suffered from the Third Reich certainly didn't like the fact that these ex-Nazis were in the United States.
The first cases came to light, like that of Herbert Axter and his wife, who were said to have mistreated forced laborers on their farm. The Axters were being sent back to Germany. Werner von Braun was lucky that his SS membership was not known back then. Also, the connection to Mittelwerk remained hidden. Although in 1947 the U.S. Army investigated the war crimes at Nordhausen. Recordings of the U.S. troops documented the horror in the concentration camp of the rocket factory near Nordhausen. In one trial, only former camp guards and capos who had mistreated the prisoners particularly severely were sentenced. One was executed. The conclusion of this process buried the topics Mittelwerk and concentration camp Mittelbau-Dora for over 20 years.
The Cold War was critical in shutting down debate. I mean, as the Cold War got worse and worse, as the anti-communist hysteria grew, it was hard to debate the issue anymore. We were using the Germans to fight the Soviets, so dissent became weaker and weaker.
The tensions between the superpowers, the US and the Soviet Union, were intensifying. At times, the world was on the brink of a nuclear war. The Germans should help to defend the so-called free world against communism. In 1957, the competition between ideologies shifted to space. With Sputnik, the Soviets put the first artificial satellite into orbit and demonstrated their superiority.
It was shocking, and it was embarrassing. It was a thing to be very concerned about, even from a military standpoint, to know that now the Russians could put something overhead and it would circle the Earth, and we were struggling and obviously had not been able to do that.
Under pressure, an untested naval missile was launched. The Vanguard exploded while still on the ramp. This failure was a big chance for Werner von Braun, Otto Rudolph, and the team from Peenemünde. A rocket developed by them successfully launched the first American satellite, Explorer, into orbit on February 1st, 1958. The Germans became the heroes of the hour. The race into space continued. The U.S. countered Russian activities with the establishment of a gigantic space agency, NASA. In a key position, Werner von Braun, and at his side, Otto Rudolph, Kurt Debus, and other colleagues from Peenemünde and Nordhausen.
The core of the German team was transferred from the Army to NASA without really changing things. Scientists and engineers who had been leaders in propulsion, guidance and control, aerodynamics, etc., they all just changed their titles slightly, but they essentially were in the same position.
The Soviet Union won the race to put the first man in space. Yuri Gagarin circled the Earth in April of 1961 and wrote history. The renewed demonstration of Russian leadership in space was a heavy defeat for the United States and its new president, John F. Kennedy. The Americans were determined to counter communism with proof of their superiority. Kennedy was under pressure, and Wernher von Braun had the experience to inspire powerful men for his projects.
He was certainly an opportunist, so he adapted himself to every context. Someone who had shaken the hands of Himmler, Goering, Goebbels, Hitler, and then American presidents from Eisenhower all the way up to Nixon. It was certainly an amazing talent for reinvention and also of covering up his past and moving on.
In May of 1961, Kennedy announced a project that would take even bold visionaries' breath away.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win.
Well, we were shocked, you might say. Dr. von Braun was dancing in the street, and others like me that down there in the ranks trying to work on this thing wondered how could we possibly do it. And you know, with my initial thought, we're going to have lots of loss of life.
The engineers were developing a multi-stage design for the flight to the moon. The Saturn V was one of the largest and most powerful rockets ever built. Arthur Rudolph would be the project director of the program. Like the other Germans, the Rudolphs had received U.S. citizenship in 1954 and had moved from White Sands to Huntsville, Alabama. Several Germans settled on a hill above the city. The Rudolphs bought a house on Panorama Drive.
After we had experienced the desert, everyone was very enthusiastic about the green hills and said, "Oh, this is like my home in Thuringia, just like my house there." And everyone was thrilled.
Not everyone in the small town was happy about the arrival of more than 100 German rocket men and their families.
The Germans were often plagued. We looked different. We wore different clothes. In shops we weren't served. Or, what was the worst thing, they served the black man before they served us. It was beginning to show that these people didn't want us there. It was wonderful for my father. He was there at work, all the other Germans were there, and German was spoken. And he felt quite comfortable. He did what his hobby was.
Huntsville was turning into Rocket City. Arthur Rudolph became technical director for the nuclear medium-range rockets Redstone and Pershing, which would later also be stationed in Germany. Then Saturn followed. The oldest university in Florida awarded Rudolph an honorary doctorate for his work. The Army honored him with the highest award for civilians. His involvement with the Nazi regime remained a well-kept secret. Hubertus Strughold was also making a career in America. He founded the world's first institute for space medicine and became a professor. His institute investigated the limits of human existence in space. Strughold already had the idea of testing the prototype of a space capsule in the laboratory at the beginning of the 1950s.
This was described countless times, that he had appeared as a great visionary. Without this capsule, one would probably never have been able to find out how the human body actually reacts, or how one can cope with this long isolation. And without this simulation, the moon landing would probably not have been possible at all.
The test subjects spent 7 days in the closed system and simulated the journey to the moon, including the recovery of water from bodily fluids. On the way to manned spaceflight, the insulation experiments were regarded as a milestone in biomedical basic research. The future President Lyndon B. Johnson personally congratulated Strughold on the successful experiment. In Huntsville, the assembly of the first Saturn V had been a failure time and time again. Arthur Rudolph remembered.
For every unsolved problem, even the smallest one, have a big red arrow attached. The next time I was called into the control room, I almost kneeled over. There was a sea of red arrows on the boards.
He worked for hours and hours. He had no time sensitivity at all. If the job needed to be done, he'd stay with it, from 8 in the morning till 12 at night.
Saturn was to be launched for the first time on November 9, 1967. To develop the necessary thrust, gigantic clamps held the rocket in place 3 seconds after the ignition of the engines, a development by Georg von Tiesenhausen.
He was instructed to somehow find a clamp that held the missile down before it launched, so that all 5 engines would have full power at the same time. So he came up with the idea of using the German beer bottle swing stopper by making the clamps so that when a lever goes to the side, then the clamps go to the side, all together.
I do remember that it seems like this thing is moving awfully slow. And what's wrong? But it's a great relief. You can breathe easier the further it goes up.
Several manned excursions into space followed and proved that a longer stay in space with appropriate protective equipment was feasible. Hubertus Strughold, the father of space medicine, retired in 1968. But of course, he was invited to the launch of Apollo 11. Cape Canaveral, July 16, 1969. The day nearly 400,000 scientists, technicians, and engineers had worked for. About 1 million people were waiting for the launch of Apollo 11 on the Florida coast.
Before us sat former President Lyndon Johnson with his First Lady, Lady Bird. And they turned around and shook our hands and said, "I am Lady Bird, I am Johnson," and so on. And then it started.
On board were the astronauts Neil Armstrong, Edwin Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. At 9:32 local time, Saturn V took off. The greatest adventure of the 20th century was broadcast live in living rooms all around the world.
Okay, Neil, we can see you coming down the ladder now.
So we got every minute with a comment from my dad, and then Neil Armstrong came out. There was dead silence. My father looked as if he wanted to say, "God, it really was possible. It really happened. There's someone on the moon. That's impossible. No way."
Neil Armstrong spoke his famous sentence.
It's one small step for man, one Science lead for mankind.
The Americans had won the prestigious race. The Russians were beaten. From 1969 to 1972, a total of 12 U.S. astronauts set foot on the moon. Neither the Soviet Union nor any other nation sent a manned mission.
Strolling on the moon one day in a merry, merry month of December. Now, May.
NASA soon made it clear to the Germans that they were no longer useful to them. Many were transferred or sent into retirement. Georg von Tiesenhausen was one of the few who still worked on projects like the space shuttle.
The Germans were slowly pushed out. It had pretty much been run by the Germans so far, and that wasn't right for many Americans. And that's when the Germans had to get out.
Arthur Rudolph retired near San Diego with his daughter. He was recovering from a heart attack when he received a letter from Washington in 1982. A special unit of the U.S. Department of Justice to track down Nazi war criminals wanted to know details about his time in Mittelberg. The accusation? He had participated in the harassment of forced laborers, including inmates of the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp. He was interviewed intensively for 2 days.
Well, I've heard the criticism that we took this action against Rudolph only because he was no longer needed by our space program or our military program. He was retired. That's not true from the standpoint of those of us at the Justice Department who worked on this case. But I have thought over the years what would have happened, what might have happened if we had tried to bring that case in 1965 rather than 1983. In 65, when the space race was well underway. I can't be sure that we would have gotten the authorization.
Rudolph asserted his innocence, but was afraid that he would not be able to cope with a trial in terms of health. He signed an agreement in which he renounced American citizenship and promised to leave the country. This way, he escaped prosecution by the American authorities. His former colleagues in Huntsville only learned about it when the Rudolphs had left the country.
Then the others, who had also worked in the Mittelwerk, were under a lot of pressure. They thought, we're next.
In fact, a special unit of the Department of Justice was targeting other former Germans.
Some of them were under investigation. We never were able to bring those cases. The evidence that we were able to amass was not sufficient, in part because all of those people refused to speak with us. They were not going to make the same mistake that Arthur Rudolph had made. They learned from the Rudolph case.
The Office of Special Investigations also dealt with Hubertus Strughold. It was not yet known to the investigators that in 1942 the physician was also responsible for negative pressure tests on children suffering from epilepsy.
Had we had the information when Strughold was still alive, I think the result likely would have been different. We probably would have prosecuted.
Hubertus Strughold died in 1986 at the age of 88 in San Antonio, Texas. The controversy surrounding his role in the Third Reich, however, means that awards are no longer named after him. The Strughold Aeromedical Library has also been renamed.
You can't prove criminal acts against him. I also believe that the question of guilt no longer arises, or should arise today in the legal sense, but that it is a question of the responsibility of scientists for their ethical actions. And in this respect, the question is, of course, still highly topical.
Arthur Rudolph and his wife Martha left the U.S. for Hamburg in March of 1984. The highly decorated American became persona non grata. An investigation was also being opened against Rudolph in Germany for aiding and abetting murder. But this trial was discontinued after the interrogation of a number of witnesses. Arthur Rudolph became a German citizen again.
It's very disappointing that German authorities chose not to prosecute. I don't know fully why that decision was made. I do believe that if today Rudolph were alive and healthy, younger than he would be today, that the decision might be a different one.
Rudolph spent the rest of his life trying to regain American citizenship, but he didn't succeed. He died in Hamburg in 1996.
The German story is very much two sides. There is the technological contribution, there's the important role in going to the moon, there's also the undeniable role in the horrible exploitation and murder of concentration camp prisoners and in using weapons to fight the war for the Third Reich.
In 1969, this story was still largely unknown. A worldwide wave of enthusiasm accompanied the spectacular journey of the first humans to the moon. But on the greatest adventure of all time, dark shadows from Germany's past still remain.